started, I have a small quiz for you guys to get re-engaged in the next group of sessions. So first question is, who knows what the meaning of bill and keep is? Raise your hand. Okay, that was like only about 10 people. Next question, who knows the definition of peering? Okay. Last one is, who understands the meaning of Metcalfe's law? Did anybody get all three right?
They want a mug? Do we win a prize?
Well, I've got $100 in my pocket, but they're Vietnamese dollars. Okay, so all three are pertinent to this conversation that we're going to be having because this is all about collaboration. And this isn't about sitting around the campfire talking about kumbaya and what could be, but is actually what's going on. So to give you a very brief overview, I'll wait until the end of the session for the definition, although I know you know all three of them. So what I want to talk about is, again...
This wasn't a part of the prep call.
It was not. This was not part of the prep call.
This is about thinking on your feet or elsewhere, so to speak.
Yeah, great. Awesome.
The idea here is essentially talking about the industry of messaging and the collaborative element of it as a cornerstone. And we're going to be talking about that in the context of all its different parameters. But most importantly, I'm going to pass it to my longstanding friend, Alison, because I was talking about an industry.
Yes, you were. And so,
Indeed.
hi, everyone. I'm Alison Billings. I'm from Twilio. I predominantly work in the US. So some of the stuff we're going to talk about, we're talking about things, collaboration, building things, learnings from the US market in Canada and vice versa, because there is a lot of vice versa actually that takes place. But for those of you in the room, okay, if you saw me earlier, I was not wearing this. How many people in this room recognize this tracksuit? Boom. That's exactly, so here we go. So here's the thing, right? Exactly, all these questions. So, from the outside, people talk about the messaging industry, right? But when we all talk about it, what we actually talk about is not an industry, but an ecosystem, right? We all rely on each other to do the work that we do. We all rely on the roles that each of our respective organizations play, and sometimes it's routing traffic, sometimes it's vetting, sometimes it's, data analysis. It's all sorts of stuff. Sometimes it's, having a competitor there to actually motivate you or to ensure that you're really prioritizing things a certain way so that you're getting to market with something that serves your customer base in the same way that their customer base is being served. And I think, when we think about an ecosystem, so a quick 30 seconds. Several years ago, I was on a panel, and my luggage was lost for multiple days. And if you know me, it's a surprise that I owned this much white at all, because I'm kind of a disaster. But I think I wore this tracksuit for multiple days, including when I spoke on the panel, and I actually apologized for wearing the tracksuit, which we don't need to get into this. So,
it's very courant. I mean, you're right in the heart of urban wear.
I walked in, and Caitlin was like, hell yeah. When I walked in the room several years ago, and I was like, I lost my luggage, But you thought I was just popping a collar.
Yeah, I was like, Alison's so effortlessly cool. She just comes in with a tracksuit.
Okay. So anyway, back to the ecosystem idea, right? Is that we all do these things over and over again and iteratively, and we're talking with each other, and our organizations have this interdependency to them, and so being collaborative and building partnerships is part of our DNA. It's part of what we do. I work predominantly in messaging compliance, right? And in the United States, when I started working in messaging 20 years ago, the best practices came out of, the consumer best practices document came out of the Mobile Marketing Association. And the first document that I saw was 3 pages long. So the first governance document was 3 pages long. I don't know how long all of the documents are now. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages if you add them all up. But I think setting the stage for the fact that we all collaborate And we all collaborate in North America, right? So whether you're in the US or whether you're in Canada, I mean, there is a big difference, more so now than possibly ever in a lot of ways. But, you know, I think, yeah, so that's the ecosystem.
Eloquently said.
Yeah,
yes.
there you go.
Spot on.
All right, there's the talking
take it back.
stick. Take it back. There you go. Done.
So, JV, in that same spirit, relative to the, let's call it the regulatory enforcement structure within the US, that's really quite different. And I'm going to be just going down the line, so to speak, because JV, I'm going to use you from the American perspective, and obviously, Caitlin, I'm going to hand off to you to do the Canuck perspective, if you will.
Yes, thank you. So there is quite a bit of regulation, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned on how to do it right. So we've kind of, by being some of the first in 10DLC, stumbling through what was an unregistered messaging ecosystem, and really 10DLC is the problem child, at least in my daily interactions. Short codes still represent a very trusted messaging. Most of it's very expensive. You have large brands that are there, but 10DLC has numerous very valuable voice-enabled use cases that have to be there. But as we went through the stumbling blocks, beginning in beta in 2019, moving into the ramp-up of registration being required in 2023, a lot of challenges. And with that, we've learned a whole lot. We learned about mandatory fields that need to be in there, how it really helps the businesses and brands understand why we need a call to action, clear message flow examples, a brand represented, functional help and stop, all the things that we expect today in A2P messaging. And those are all similarities that we share here. So those components, you really have this great framework to learn on and build your version of this as you move forward. And we're sending messages across the border today, absolutely. But I think there's a great place that you sit here to be able to learn on how this works and also integrate and facilitate the things that are working. The elements that exist today in campaign ID and TLV values, the relationships with folks that have spent a great deal of effort, net number and Aegis to do vetting and to do number resolution, those things really power this. And we don't want to break those elements, at least I don't want to. I mean, that's more work for us. But at the same time, we need to think about how we can build a framework that really, strengthens those elements and does it in a way that is respectful to the Canadian ecosystem.
So as I said, with the U.S. perspective, it's a very regulatory and governmental focus in terms of the oversight, not of the messaging business per se, but just the telecommunications business per se. In Canada, it's fairly unregulated. In the context, it is self-regulated. It is industrially regulated. Does that foster, or does that create an obstacle to how things can get done? And I'd like both your perspectives from the U.S. as well as the Canadian perspective.
Okay, want me to kick it off first?
Sure.
All right. So we have challenges. Certainly, we have the CTIA helps us with common written practices. Now, it's incorporated 10DLC, for example, and TFN's incorporated into the messaging best practices as opposed to the short code handbook. So now you've got two documents you really have to follow here. There's also been an initiative by the CTI, the Secure Messaging Initiative, which is a group of segmented participants that work towards identifying the type of targeted issues that occur in the ecosystem, and then we work with collaboration here on this group. So these working groups are key for us to be able to be successful. Where we used to work as competitors, we have to do this to succeed, is to work as collaborators.
And I also just want to contextualize something about the Secure Messaging Initiative, which is that the Secure Messaging Initiative is something that is being run through CTIA as part of a engagement campaign to ensure that messaging in the United States maintains its self-regulation. Like US messaging is self-regulated. Mm-hmm. CTIA does a spectacular job of advocating for our industry to ensure that messaging remains self-regulated so that we can have the kind of dynamic responses that we have had for the last 20 plus years in addressing the areas of development that are needed and where attention needs to be focused, right? Like, Jonathan and I work together. We're competitors, but we also collaborate, because of the fact that we're advocating for our ecosystem, right? And I think, Caitlin, I didn't mean to take away time from you, but I think it's really important when there are opportunities for, talking about 10DLC, there are lessons that have been learned. Rolling out 10DLC in Canada, understanding that most of the people in the room work across the border, right, in some way. Those learnings will be imbued in what's coming across the border, but also there are things that can be done, things can always be done better and more efficiently and more effectively, right? So.
I completely agree with both of you, and I think the self-regulation piece about our industry is unique, and I think that gives us a lot of autonomy, right? We have the ability to we have the license, the creative license to establish these working groups, these frameworks, these policy documents, so that we can protect that autonomy that we have. We want to avoid over-regulation. So being this self-regulated industry, being able to work with each other, being able to work across the border. CTA, we've got a fantastic relationship with CTIA, and we chat, we share learnings, and I think everyone on this panel at some point over the years, I've needed to pick your brains about something because I don't pretend to know everything about our ecosystem. There's a lot of technical components that CTA doesn't have direct line of sight into. So why would I create a policy, a framework that doesn't take into account the people who actually need to use it? And I think that we have such a great opportunity with things like 10DLC, with RCS and RBM, to be able to learn from other markets and then take that collaborative approach in Canada to see how we can be thoughtful about a launch. Not to say that other markets haven't been thoughtful about it, but I think being a little bit slower to launch and kind of still in that crawl stage of the crawl, walk, run allows us to be mindful and hopefully create some efficiencies and be able to learn from other markets. And it's honestly what I love most about my job and what I do at CTA is getting to do that kind of collaborative problem solving that I think as our industry, I think we're really great at that.
So John, you have a purpose here. It's not just the carrier aggregators, if you will. The context from where you sit is essentially you straddle these initiatives and have to react to these initiatives. And so that's why we wanted to have essentially, let's call it a vendor perspective or a facilitator perspective to the conversation. So I'll pass that along to you. I know you have a few comments.
Well, yes, hey, it does work. Yeah, it's a very, very large industry between the two countries, quite honestly, with 1,500 plus participants, helping to deliver, messaging, for example, to these markets, and so the ability for all of us to, communicate, integrate, and share information is really critical to the success of the channel overall. But I don't think people realize just how many players are involved, not just from an infrastructure perspective, but from the brand all the way up to the carrier's network. More than 1,000 plus players. In terms of sharing, yeah, there is a lot of collaboration. We happen to work both with CTIA and CTA, providing compliance services, but we also work with all of the DCAs and trying to help them. With both the vetting and onboarding, but we're also trying to do collaboration so that if a brand has been verified and vetted, we don't want to do them 6 different times for each channel down the road, right? We don't want to do them both in the US and in Canada. We want to do them once and they can operate, across all. And so, this collaboration and communications between all of us will drive efficiency, and efficiency will drive down cost, and driving down cost will drive higher, business, if you will.
So let me challenge that on the efficiencies in the context of you guys all represent extremely large industries, extremely large companies. Does that mean that the smaller and medium aggregators, the guys who are trying to put another type of solution, something that's innovative, into the marketplace, are they at a disadvantage because they just don't have the resources to specifically apply to these kind of challenges and these types of initiatives? It's like the old boy-girls club dynamic. You know, are you wearing the right tie? Are you large enough, et cetera?
I think they have to be a part of the discussions, right? The ecosystem is not just DCAs and carriers. There needs to be a space for resellers, for ASPs, for CSPs, because they're, at the end of the day, they're really the voice of the brand in a lot of cases. And the brands are who we need to use these products and use these channels. And I think that it's critical to foster an environment and a forum where all of the different players, regardless of size, regardless of reach that they have an opportunity to be a part of those discussions. Because a lot of the time they're servicing those SMBs, those sole props, and that's so much of the market. So I think that we have to include them in the conversations that we have.
Right. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Alison.
No, I just think that, like, the edge keeps moving out, right? Like, I don't know what the edge is anymore. I haven't known what the edge is probably for, maybe, I'll be generous and give myself 8 years, But, like, the innovation that's happening is constant, right? Like, I literally have been doing this for 20 years. Like, I don't know what's going on. I know a lot of stuff, but I don't know what's happening on the edge, right? And as we bring more and more robust solutions to market, those robust solutions with media and all of this other stuff is going to become something that none of us in this room, none of us, ever would have come up with, right? Because our experience of this, like, you can only take it as far, right, as you can imagine. And I come up with all of these parameters, and I'm like, yeah, but in the network capacity, like, I immediately go there. People who are on the edges aren't thinking about network capacity, right? So I think, to that end, like, we're here to create these spaces for future state innovation, right? And for me, part of that future state innovation is ensuring that we maintain a self-regulated space so that as those edges get folded in, they don't hit some legal wall, right? Where all of a sudden, like, there's this incredible opportunity that has a lot of really phenomenal impact, and it can't go to market because it doesn't comply with X, Y, or Z.
Right. Very aptly put, you were exactly the direction that I was heading in the context of where are the boundaries and how do we maneuver our various initiatives against those constantly moving boundaries that we're not creating. It's the innovation that can be either destructive or constructive, and we play with both at the same time.
I would say that the destructive stuff is pretty knowable. I think the constructive stuff is actually where it's the most exciting. Right?
Yeah.
And I think relatively speaking, from an impact perspective, like, there's a whack-a-mole. We all deal with a whack-a-mole of illegitimate traffic and unwanted traffic and, like, fraud and all of these things. But in the grand scheme of things, we can't let those, like, the size of this ecosystem that we manage, the amount of fraud that could be happening, like, is far more than we see because of all the phenomenal work we all do every single minute of every day. We all have these platforms that manage all of this, I think we can't let those little things cause some sort of hysterical situation that then results in us not being able to facilitate, the next wave of communications innovators being able to do what they, want to do, need to do, should be doing to service their contemporaries, right? Yeah. Like,
So what you're essentially saying that you should stick to a strategy, so to speak, and understand that it's a long-term strategy. But I'm wondering, kind of a little bit of a pivot here in the context of what could be done to improve the processes that we work with on a day-to-day basis today?
I can go.
down the line.
So first, we have to get framework, and I think if you sit and think about this, it becomes obvious. You need the context of what are the, if you look at the problematic centers or bad actor scenarios, it's what does that traffic look like? The content samples that are out there. Who's it coming from? So the sender or the canary numbers that are associated with that. It is a representation of spoof brands and the folks that are being impersonated, and how do we solve those problems of account takeovers? You can almost look at traffic and distinguish, diagnose when it's an ATO event. So these things, all of the scales. So you can't do this with me emailing Alison for every example or talking to Infobip or Bandwidth. We do that still today, but we need to have APIs that allow us to do this, a framework of governance that allows us in a structured way to be able to share this. We also need to be able to do this and share it because we are operating as competitors, and we're operating with carriers in mind, we're operating with industry partners where we have to all be able to collaborate. And to do this, we need to talk about how we put that framework together.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can share a factual implementation. So, in the US, most of the messaging channels, there is vetting and onboarding independently done. But on top of that, there is market monitoring and there is complaint analytics. In other words, swipe right, report junk. It comes to the carrier. Carrier, in this instance, gives it to us. We read them all. And we then take the sending number, dip it into our friends at NetNumber who are out there and say, which DCA does this sending number belong to? And we're reporting immediately those messages to those DCAs. We're working now, we've got risk scores on them. Are these harmful, or are these just somebody that doesn't like their girlfriend anymore, or their boyfriend anymore? There is, some bad, traffic in there, and so we're able to identify it. But in this instance, we've closed the loop, right? So we can also look at that sending number and tie it back to our registries. We've got the campaign registry in TCR that has all the registered phone numbers. We've got short code vetting and onboarding where we know the brand that's supposed to be on that short code, and in that complaint, that brand's not on that short code, or, fortunately so far they have been because it's been going well. So, the idea though of having a closed loop compliance model, becomes extremely powerful. We proved it back in 2014 with the collapse of premium SMS in the US and then the collapse in Canada in 2015-16. By the way, that's when the regulators were involved up here, quite deep. So the idea is that we want to stay self-governant, then you create closed-loop compliance capabilities with cross-communications of all the players, because all the DCAs we're reporting to don't want bad traffic coming from their networks, and so they're taking this information very seriously. The fact that we have large registries and we know every, pretty much hop, for example, for 10DLC, we can trace back to where it came from, and the fact that we're vetting says we know the brand. And oh, by the way, whack-a-mole, if we know the brand and we know they're bad, we can shut them down and prevent them from ever coming back and registering again. So this is really about sharing the information from a life cycle perspective with all the players.
So my question kind of to the group is, do we feel like, so I agree that I think that closed loop is important, but is it still a little bit siloed? Like, is there an opportunity for us to share more information? We have all of this great data. We're kind of sharing it for that specific sender type or that specific DCA. But I think where there's an opportunity to go further is sharing across DCAs, sharing across channels or sender types, right? I think that would really close the loop.
Yeah, you'll open up some legal issues in terms of saying, hey, this brand is bad, and just sharing that out into the market. Right. But on the flip side, if you have a central point of entry for every brand, and oftentimes when we shut down a bad actor, we go through all the 4.1 million background checks that we've done in the last 3 years, and we identify related companies. And so we can shut all those down. But once we have all that information on that company, the place to stop them is when they try to re-enter the market.
But you have to acknowledge that there's a significant problem with account takeovers. So going after a brand that suffers literally an account takeover for 20 minutes, like you can't take a brand and all of its affiliated brands out because they had account takeovers, right?
Agree. Sometimes it's a sub-aggregator, right?
But
we just don't know.
But there's a valid
or as a hacker
point there, and I think one of the learnings I think that is important to fold into actually some of the stuff in terms of rolling things out in Canada is like, where are the opportunities to create space for brands that were non-compliant to become compliant, right? Because companies can change, brands can change, messaging practices can change, right? Companies that weren't compliant at one point can become compliant, right? And when you're talking about innovation, right, let's be really clear. Like, I bet if we all took a test, myself included, on current messaging standards in the United States and Canada, there is not a single person in this room that would score 100% correct. Because, except Eddie DeCurtis, of course. But, you know, so that said, and the reason being is because things are really complicated. And so if you're driving an innovative service and there's a messaging component to it, right? Yeah, you could end up sending things in a disallowed sending way, not realizing it, because what you're actually doing is viral engagement, and you don't have the right consent type because it's not truly conversational or whatever it is. It gets flagged. It gets flagged for section this, section that, subsection this criteria, this thing, right? And like, we can all do the citations, but the reality is, if we want to keep messaging alive and flourishing and innovation happening on it, there also needs to be space created for like simplifying things
And reform.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do we get to that nirvana state in the sense of reform, process, implementation, agreement across such a diverse and such a diverse ecosystem?
Well, we have processes both in Canada and the U.S. where we are providing compliance issues, you know, back to the DCAs and then back on down to the brand, you know, to fix these things that are not compliant. And that's really about optimizing the consumer experience. That's not fraud, right? So, you know, giving feedback is a closed loop, both in Canada and the U.S. on, you know, short codes and other channels today in terms of non-compliant, you know, messaging. What I was talking about earlier was fraud. That's when I'm talking about shut down, prevent them from coming back. Compliance, though, you know, 99 point whatever % of companies out there, they want to just communicate with their business, their customers, and do it right. And sometimes they just don't know. So yes, having that ability to give feedback, it does exist. It's a matter of, can we make it even more efficient? Can we scale it? Can we make it, you know, quicker to repair it, you know, back to market?
Right.
Yeah, it shouldn't be one strike and you're out. Unless we're talking about fraud, but like John said, a lot of these issues are not malicious. They're not trying to be harmful. They're not trying to deceive anyone. But educating brands when the brand could be 3-4 hops away from the DCAs tend to be the experts on compliance.
Of course.
They have the most responsibility. The carriers put the most accountability on the DCAs. So education is really tough. And I think that that is certainly an opportunity where, as an industry, we can probably do better to educate, to have more resources available, to be able to educate brands about what those rules and policies are, but also what happens if you don't follow those policies. And I think there's definitely opportunity there.
Yeah. JV, you have a capstone?
Just to add, so the education is critical. So people need to be aware of the type of attacks that are out there. And the attacks that we deal with as DCAs, typically, they've matured. So the MNOs and the DCAs, we can see a broader perspective of the bad actors, where they come from, how they move quickly, and we need to share that. So we're not going to survive if we aren't able to do that amongst ourselves, but we need collaboration from the carriers.
Right.
They also see this occurring on their network. We need to communicate this to the subscribers so they're aware. I mean, you heard statistics today. The end users are the folks that fall prey to this, and they need to be able to recognize these things and understand what's happening. And then we have to educate our particular customers or resellers. Maybe they focus on the UCaaS model, and that's where you have a lot of social engineering. They need to be aware of the type of attacks that are focused on their business, their market, so that we can bring everybody up in the space where they're have the right prophylactic measures in place.
Right.
Well, I think to Eddie's point that he made earlier, the average consumer doesn't understand the difference in sender types. Right? So they have a bad experience with SMS that erodes their trust in the entire channel. And it's our responsibility to maintain that level of trust and to improve it as best we can. We need consumers to use these channels.
Right. We could continue, but we've run out of time. We've got opportunity for one question. Any questions? All right, I'll give you the answer to the 3 questions that were asked earlier in the session, which was, I believe, the first I mentioned was bill and keep. Bill and keep was a commercial model that was utilized by the American operators at the inception of the mobile network operator business back in the late 1990s, which was essentially messages could flow freely between all the operators, which was in contrast to the Europeans, which was essentially they were using a termination fee, much like a postage stamp. Put a postage stamp on a postcard, send it off. It's going to be guaranteed that it'll be delivered, but there was a revenue share between the originating sender and the deliverer of the message. So that's been the model that we operate in and we've been thriving on over the last 30 years. The second was peering. Peering is essentially collaborating with your competitors to be able to send to messages that you may not have a direct carrier connection to. And then the last piece is Metcalfe's Law. Metcalfe's Law is how we have all gotten enriched, both personally, wealth, experientially, et cetera, in terms of how messaging works, which is a network increases in value exponentially with each additional node added to it. Those are the 3. Is Virginie still here? I know she knows all these things. Okay, we're done. Thank you very much.